Hi, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We've got our two speakers here with us, joining us from the East Coast of Canada, Eric Tusz-King and Siri Jackson-Wood. Today's webinar is focusing on tools to measure your co-op forward motion. We're going to look at two specific tools today. This is the voice of Erin Hancock. I'm the Manager of Research and Education with Co-operatives and Mutuals Canada. Okay, so I wanted to introduce to you the Measuring the Co-op Difference Research Network, which is the host of these webinars that some of you have been attending all the way back to 2010 at this point. So our research network is a pan-Canadian research network comprised of academic researchers, students, and co-op practitioners. We've got 4 research clusters across Canada that sort of helps us organize our research. One of them being the Atlantic cluster, which is going to be the featured group for today, and 2 of the tools that have been developed through their research. So we're funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. It started back in 2010 and it runs until 2015. And we're engaging in projects that explore social, economic, and environmental impacts of co-ops on communities in Canada. So Eric Tusz-King is a co-op developer, and he brings many years of experience to assist various types of new and exciting co-ops. So he's a member of Energreen Builders Co-operative, a worker-owned home construction co-op that builds passive solar homes and renovates existing homes for improved energy efficiency. Eric is also the chair of the board of Open Sky Co-operative, which is a charitable cooperative that's an organic farm where adults who face barriers due to social, developmental, or mental health challenges can improve their well-being and independence through residential and day programs. And along with this, he also has direct co-op experience of over 28 years working in community development and also with social and environmental justice issues with the United Church of Canada. His formal education includes 2 master's degrees. He didn't want to stop at just one. He had more learning to do. And one of those is in adult education in community development appropriately. And he's the vice president and the Atlantic director of the board of the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation. And he's represented the Federation in a recent effort to rewrite the Cooperatives Act in New Brunswick. So clearly he brings with him a whole host of different hats that he's wearing. And we want to thank you, Eric, for joining us today.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here. I've been involved with this conversation for a while. I'm glad to be able to share some of my experience with it.
Okay, excellent. So I wanted to make a note to the folks who are joining us today on the webinar that some of the things that you'll see popping up on the screen while Eric is speaking are photos from the Energreen Builders Co-op members at work and some of the projects that they've been working on. And you'll also see some sample pages from the Co-op Index tool report, because we want you to have an idea as to what that looks like. So just a note for folks. So Eric, let's kick things off. So Eric, we had sent some things around to folks who are joining us in the webinar today, but just for those who didn't get a chance to go through it in detail, give us a little bit of a brief overview of what the Co-op Index does and how it does it.
Well, the Co-op Index is a tool to help worker co-ops. That's the first thing I need to say. It was originally based on a tool that Ryszard Stocky, who's a psychologist, organizational psychologist from Poland, helped create for nonprofit organizations to measure themselves against their own ideals. And then it was developed in collaboration with a variety of groups in Canada, St. Mary's Masters in Cooperative Management. Some of the worker co-ops in Canada and the U.S. participated, and the Canadian Workers Cooperative Federation was how we got involved, and particularly through Peter Huff, who was the staff person there, and I'll mention his name a couple of times. I participated in the initial development of this tool because of my experience in both adult education and as a member of Energreen Builders Cooperative. And then after it was completed, Energreen, the members themselves agreed to be a test for that trial phase. It's a, just need to get my, there it is. It's a tool that is to be used specifically with worker co-ops and that have been operating for at least a while because it's not a tool for early development stage. It's really for the based upon the life experience of the cooperative. So it needs that base platform first before it can go any further. Some of the assumptions that lie behind it is that it draws upon workers and members and employees, I should say, experience, those attitude and convictions of the workers, and analyzes their answers to the various questions that are going to be asked up against the co-op's own documents and policies and processes that are developed by the co-op. That's really important. It's both internal and external in the types of data that it's gathering.
Okay, got it.
The questionnaire that is set out, it develops these characteristics of ideal workers and the principles and values of cooperatives. And we draw not only the International Cooperative Alliance principles and values, but also used the Mondragon's values that were quite helpful in this. But they don't see those things all by themselves. They see them in collaboration or in relationship with one another. And often we found in the questions when we took it as a cooperative that some of the questions seem very similar to each other. But that's because these different aspects can't be separated one from another. The final thing that we received was this this report that has all these 5 different or 4 different categories of indices that is possible for that. The organizational maturity index, the trust index, the values index, and the principles index. All those things were part of that final report.
Okay, excellent. So could you fill us in on why exactly the Energreen Builders Co-op decided to become involved in using this tool and in this project?
The Energreen had been on, by the time this report or the tool was becoming available to us, we had been in operation for about 3 years. And we knew that we had certain procedures and bylaws in place and administrative and communication processes that had been developed, and our membership was becoming more comfortable and more open to critique itself and from outside critique. So we knew that we were ready for that type of conversation, but we also knew that we had something to evaluate. Our group is not a particularly familiar with this type of educational or organizational analysis tool, but I personally had that experience, and I was quite comfortable with recommending the tool to our members of our board, and I respected Peter Huff's experience as a co-op developer. Members of our co-op had met Peter before in the actual formation of our co-op, so they were willing to have Peter be the co-op developer who worked along with us and hear Peter's analysis and recommendations that would help. I felt very comfortable with the recommendation, and back in 2009, I think it was, our board finally agreed to participate in that.
Okay, got it. Okay, well, thanks so much. I mean, it's really neat to think that there's, when you're talking about all the different indices, that there could be all these disparate things it feels that you're trying to abide by, and they can come all together into one tool. It feels like something that folks would be motivated to pick up on, but indeed it does take a commitment from the board to move forward with that.
Yeah.
So tell us what it was like to use the tool. So the process that you used to go through this with the other members of Energreen, and in terms of the surveys, interviews, and so forth.
When we used the tool, we had 2 options for completing the questionnaire. One was to respond in a printed copy and return it to Peter Huff by mail, and a second option was to complete the questionnaire electronically and send the document back to Peter by email. Again, our members aren't that computer savvy, so several members did not use the computer, so to have the option to be able to complete the printed copy was a necessity in order for us to participate. We had very good participation, and it went well. Peter then interviewed me as a manager, gathered our bylaws, our policies and administrative communication and decision-making processes, and from that he then developed his report.
Okay, great. And what kinds of feedback did you get based on these surveys or scorecards, and what kinds of results did you get?
Yeah, I need to answer this question by taking it back to the point when we actually completed the questionnaire, because there was a fair amount of lag time, probably almost a year by the time we completed the project, the questionnaires, until Peter was able to give us the report. Not quite, probably about 9 months. But in that period of time, we had already started to look at the types of questions, the type of concerns that the questionnaire had addressed. So we had an opportunity to actually learn from the actual participation in completing the questionnaire, and then had the opportunity to 9 months later, to actually hear what Peter had prepared in his report, and then we were able to reflect on that. So we already were up and going by the time we got the final report. But to say what type of results, one of our concerns was around communication. And as with most organizations, there's poor communication sometimes, there's good communication, and sometimes there's just no communication. By the time we received Peter's report, we had already started to develop some electronic communication strategies. We'd set up weekly meetings to review work schedules as a worker cooperative that was dispersed. That was a long time when we wouldn't see each other, so we needed to have those regular meetings. When we received Peter's report itself, it confirmed our overall analysis that we need to improve our communication, and then we made a few comments and recommendations that we had not considered. However, Energreen members were open to these, and because they reflected and corresponded to our own work that we were engaged in. So the comments were germane to what we were about. An area that the co-op was was highly rated on was with respect to the co-op principles and values. Along with the general overall high rating, there were still some areas among the 23 topics or components of principles and values that were graded as low in comparison. These areas were cooperation among cooperatives, democracy, and equity. It was helpful to have the outsiders' comments in some of these areas because it provided information and perspective that was not easily addressed from within the co-op's membership. For example, with regard to being a new cooperative, we were so intent on doing our work, getting our business going, that we hadn't put a lot of value on cooperation among cooperatives. Our noses were to the task, and we had to make the company survive. The value seemed to be remote and very limited to our immediate needs. But as a result of this report, we went on, and coincidentally, it worked in well with the International Year of Cooperatives, so it then picked up. Another example was around equity. It was a topic that was lying beneath the surface and had the potential of creating a great deal of mistrust and destabilize actually the co-op. Seeing the results of the survey allowed the topic to be discussed and addressed openly without having it become directly from those members who were felt maybe uncomfortable or unsupported with raising it before. So again, it was the value of having that third person eye into seeing what's going on in the relationship that was valuable to us.
Well, yeah, and I suppose because everyone had agreed to go through the process, then not just having Peter, but having this whole structure in place that everyone agreed to sort of allowed you to get some of these things out on the table because you sort of knew that the group, you had the will of the group to do that kind of work.
Yeah, very much. Yeah.
So what would you say you did as a result of doing this? So did you take any new actions? Did you make any changes to the organization based on your results in this process? Yep.
As I said, some of the things we had acted on before we even received the report. but just because we had answered the questions. But this was particularly true with regard to communication. The full report was given to each member when it was received, and the board of directors created a subgroup to respond to the full report. I just counted the pages. I think it's some 60-some pages in the full report, so it's quite a substantial document. This small group brought comments and recommendation on each of the 19 recommendations that it had. We then grouped all these recommendations into 3 areas that we wanted to work on. One was the process of clarifying Energreen's vision. A second one was around clarifying the long-term commitments to Energreen. And the last one was just a bunch of miscellaneous recommendations that didn't fit into any of the earlier 2 categories. With regard to clarifying the long-term commitments to Energreen, this grew out of the information that there were several members who would probably retire and leave the co-op for the next few years. We knew that coming into when we created the co-op, that there were a number of us who were going to retire within probably 10 years. So we wanted to take stock of both our individual commitment to Energreen and Energreen's commitments to its members. We set up a commitment committee to spearhead this discussion, and their work consisted of another survey asking each member what were his or her commitment and what they wanted from Energreen. This process lasted just over a year. This discussion solidified the membership's commitment and clarified some of their reduction to the commitment. What I mean by that is that some people then said, well, maybe I'm not going to stay for another 10 years, and a couple of people left over the next year or 2 in that period, all with good feelings. But just asking the question what the commitment the members had towards the cooperative and what they wanted from the cooperative allowed us to pursue things like continuing education, employee benefits such as group insurance and pension. All those things were really very helpful. And then finally, with regard to clarifying the Energreen's vision, that was helped by some work on board development and developing the cooperative difference in our business plan.
Excellent. Well, I've heard of a lot of different committees in co-ops over the years, but a commitment committee is one I hadn't heard of. You got to wonder what the turnover rate is on that committee.
Well, it went very well, and both of those committees had a limited time to report, did its work, and then we went on to some other things.
Yeah, in this, being where you are at the stage of business, it makes a lot of sense. So yeah. That's pretty neat, actually. So tell us, in terms of, because this tool is sort of it's still in development in some ways, it's being tested and used and that kind of thing, even though it still has immediate value. What would you say are the biggest challenges for you and your co-op in using this co-op index tool?
There were 2 challenges for us to use the co-op. The first was the use of the tool was foreign to most of our members. As I said, most of them are not familiar with this type of organizational tool, and that made it initially difficult to participate because most had either a bad experience of some outside evaluators. They weren't familiar with self-assessment and things like that. But once it was agreed to participate, there was still some discomfort with discussing sensitive issues and making recommendations that required higher expressions of commitment. That was so. It's this type of a questionnaire or this survey takes some time, pulls up some difficult questions, so you need to be able to prepare. You need to prepare yourselves for that. The other thing is, as I mentioned earlier, the report is very comprehensive. It made lots of recommendations that could and then did take us in very different directions. As a board of directors, it was difficult to track the original recommendations and the various directions that we pursued. Having a couple of board committees, the commitment committee and later the vision committee, to focus some of that work was really made it much easier to work. But it still demanded a fair amount of work on my behalf, my work as manager, to remind the board about the miscellaneous things or the tasks that weren't already been looked at. So there was a lot of monitoring and scheduling and keeping at the tasks that made it a bit tough.
Got it. Okay. Well, thanks, Eric. I just have one final question for you on this tool for now, and then, of course, we'll have questions towards the end. But what would you say to other co-ops that are thinking of using this tool?
Well, first I would say for any worker cooperative, the tool is valuable, and it can be valuable to other worker co-ops. I think it's a good tool. If it was being considered by another form of cooperative, I would not be as strong in that recommendation. I've not seen it used by another type of cooperative. And that's because the type of questions that are asked of worker cooperatives are very sometimes personal, highly committed, because your whole work experience and your livelihood is dependent upon that worker co-op. But if the co-ops, if another form of cooperative is willing to go to that level of exploration, then I would say go for it. It's a good comprehensive tool.
Well, thanks very much, Eric. Thanks for sharing your experiences using this.
You're welcome.
It
Looking
sounds
forward
like
to
it
hearing more.
Okay, absolutely. So for now, we'll shift gears over to looking at the Sustainability and Planning Scorecard with Siri Jackson-Wood joining us from PEI today. So welcome, Siri.
Hi, Erin. Glad to be here.
Oh, good. I'm going to share a little bit about your background for folks. I'm sure you're a familiar face to some, but I'll give a little bit. So Siri, you started working with cooperatives on PEI back in 2008, and when you were elected to the board of the Morell Consumers Co-op. I've been there, I should say myself. And since then, you've been involved in various aspects of the co-op sector. So you've been able to sort of develop your appreciation in terms of the value of co-ops on the island and how it contributes to the makeup of the province. And so you currently serve as president of the PEI Co-op Council, the provincial association there in PEI. And through that, you've been volunteering at the high school level, facilitating the co-op youth program, which is pretty neat. I hope folks will go to the website and check that out. And you've worked with co-ops in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI in the learning aspect in terms of using specific tools aimed at sustainability and proactive assessment, which we'll be hearing more about today. And also in co-op development internationally with the Canadian Cooperative Association working in Uganda and East Africa. And we could have a whole other webinar on that because there was an interesting tool used there as well. I should note that Siri is currently running for the board of Co-op Atlantic, where you're looking forward, I understand, Siri, to applying your various experiences with co-ops and in turn also expand your knowledge of this ever-growing sector.
It's always a learning process.
That's it. So Siri currently lives in St. Peter's Bay on Prince Edward Island with 2 daughters, Jody and Leah, and a dog, cat, and crow, I should say, for interest's sake. And you're working in the capacity of bookkeeper with Right Stop Cooperative, right? So lots of different ways of being involved in the sector. Yes. So welcome, and thanks for bringing all of your experience to this webinar today.
Thank you very much for having me. I keep looking out the window here. I'm watching the dog and the crow are fighting over a ball as you were introducing me. I wish I could show it to everyone, but I'm glad to be here.
Well, thank you, Siri. So, again, for folks who had registered prior to the end of last week, we did send around a PDF so that folks could take a look at things ahead of time. But Siri, for those folks who haven't got a chance to go through all of that, could you start by giving us a bit of a brief overview of what the scorecard does and how it works?
Sure, I can do my best. It is a detailed tool. However, its use is, once you've begun to use the tool, it's very simplistic. It's not frightening. It's very helpful. As you can see, I believe there's a slide below right now. Let me mute myself or shrink myself so you can see it. There we go.
So we're seeing the front page of the tool.
Yes, yes. And I want to point out that, as Eric was just mentioning, his tool, the index, was geared towards worker co-ops, where this tool is geared more towards the retail cooperative. In fact, my co-op that I sit on the board with is a grocery store co-op, and we use the scorecard to assist us in our growth and development, and found it was perfect for the grocery retail. So firstly, I'd like to stress that the scorecard is not a test. It's an ongoing method that's used to assess where your cooperative stands in relation to the best practices for optimum success. The tool sets a baseline for you, individual for every co-op, and from this baseline, you can observe or measure your growth as you become familiar with and use these best practices. Shows you some of them right there. It gives you the opportunity to recognize areas needing improvement as well as areas worthy of congratulations. And we all know that we need congratulations to continue. The scorecard is broken down into the 4 sections you see there on the slide. Each one contains questions that, when answered very honestly, will give your co-op a starting point to grow from. That's your baseline. These areas cover the 7 co-op principles as well as social, economic, and environmental measures. Within each section, your co-op is asked to determine whether the information being discussed is a high priority. You can see that on the slide there. This is another truthful question. You have to determine how important each of these areas is to your co-op. And in most cases, you'll find that that is a high priority. And some of them are set for you because it's just a given that that is important for a cooperative success. Now, once you've established that priority, the tool goes further and digs into the meat of the area, and we discover through professional and personal introspection what we as members, management, staff, and directors, because everyone can use the tool, what we can do to set our co-op on a path of constant improvement. The scorecard is not a tool to use just once, receive results, and file it away. It's meant to be a continuous process, and the efforts that are put into it will be reflected in the results seen by your co-op. The initial use of the tool is going to take time. I found it's best if it's broken into blocks of 2 or 3 hours at a time. As mentioned, the first time is similar to an overall assessment, which will give you a baseline as well as a direction for ways to improve in the areas that are needed. So the first time, the beginning is tricky, but once you get into the flow of the tool, you really start to move quickly, and it takes a commitment.
Okay, thanks, Siri. And could you just tell us quickly why it is that the Morell Co-op decided to become involved and use this tool?
Well, it was about 4 or 5 years ago, actually, when we started working with it, or started working with the development process, and we were undergoing a major renovation, a huge $750,000 renovation. And it was at this time as well that the Measure the Co-op Difference Research Network was looking for co-ops to take part in this development of both tools, the scorecard and the index. We talked about it. We actually talked about it after the fact, but we were improving our store visually and interiorly, and we thought it would be fitting to improve our overall strategic composition as well. And the scorecard seemed as if that would answer some questions for us. And it was a potential improvement that wasn't going to cost us more money. And that was a significant area that we had to consider at that time, was not spending more than we had to spend. So
You got in at the right time.
I think we did.
Tell us what it was like to take part in the development of the tool, and in terms of the process and how you worked with your fellow board members and living this process for the past few years.
Well, our board was unknowingly volunteered to take part in the process. I brought up the idea. When I first brought it up, the directors weren't jumping up and down saying, pick me, pick me. In fact, I felt guilty because I had signed us up at the Co-op Atlantic AGM without consulting the others on the board first. At this point, I really didn't know what we'd signed up for, had an idea, but I really needed the other directors on side if we were going to benefit from the process. I started enticing the group by preparing full dinners for all of us, and we would work through the supper hour, and then with coffee and dessert, we'd wrap up each 2 or 3 hour meeting, and as long as the food kept coming, they kept coming, so it really worked well. It worked. I don't recall exactly how many of these meetings we had, but there were quite a few. And during this development stage, we would work to determine what we were tasked with doing was determining the importance, the relevance, and the practicality of each of the questions. At this point, there were, I believe, 187 or so questions that we were working with, and it's been trimmed right down since then. because many, of course, were not necessary, and many were very important. And it was up to us to try and show what we thought would work for us. At times, it was really tedious and very dry. But looking back and reading between the lines, it really brought us together as a board. Many of the questions led to discussions, which inevitably would teach us more about our co-op, its inner workings. This development stage produced results similar to what we experienced while recently using the finished product, which we have just started doing about 2 months ago. So as a board, we learned about many aspects of the manager's job that normally we wouldn't think about. As well, our manager began to realize the depth of a director's responsibilities and how they related directly to him. So our communication opened there. For example, the hierarchy for proper communication between board and management had really not been observed. For example, there were many questions as a board director, a secretary. I would go into the store to do my grocery shopping, and staff members would come up to me and ask me questions about how to do things dealing with their manager. Where that's not the right hierarchy. That's a recipe for catastrophe. And through using the tool, we learned about proper governance. We learned about the communication, the lines of communication, and how this should properly be adhered to. And the same could have been said about our staff and director discussions. There was confusion, but with successful outcomes that couldn't really be realized when we had this confusion. The scorecard section concerning governance initiated these discussions, which answered the unasked questions, who should speak with whom, and also clearly showed us the best route towards successful conflict resolution. That, I'm sure any of you that have had to deal with conflicts understand that conflict resolution is the utmost of importance within proper communication between board and staff or board and management. Another example, which took place just quite recently, was we started using the portion under the principles, the 7 principles. And while we were answering questions pertaining to strategic planning, it became obvious that we had never really had a formal strategic planning session. This led to a discussion about goals and objectives, our mission and our vision, and the importance of having an operational plan updated regularly for our manager to follow. Not only would this make our job, would make our job as directors more clear, but it would also give our manager a clear direction, and we'd both be in on it. It was decided that we would hire a facilitator immediately following our AGM, which takes place next week, and develop a strategic plan. Then we're going to share this with our membership as well as with the staff. So everyone's in on what our progress, what our process plan is going to be. The end result that I just mentioned was directly related to our use of the scorecard. So kudos to the scorecard in that area. In our experience, I believe we learned a great deal in the development process of our scorecard. And having said that, we haven't completed our first actual use of the tool yet. We've been at it for a couple months, and we are moving forward, but we're picking and choosing the areas that work for us right now. In fact, that's something I should mention, is that the tool, you don't start with question 1 and carry through to the end. You can, but it's also quite helpful if you go to areas that you think you might need development strategies for. Maybe you need more help in the social area. Maybe your economic principles or policies are not up to par. So you could begin there as opposed to beginning with the 7 principles, which is where the tool does begin. I have no doubt that we will learn a great deal more before this process is finished. For the first go-around, our current president did a fantastic job just recently facilitating the tool with the board and credited that to being a part of the development committee. So this shows that once you use the tool for the second or the next time, because it is continuous, as I mentioned earlier, it begins to really flow very nicely. And once that happens, you just keep going. It's great.
Well, and I should mention, too, that there are photos that are being shown now of the Morell Co-op and also some screenshots of the tool as well, so people can get a feel for how it actually looks. So if you want to just give us a highlight of what yourself and the board learned about the co-op by being involved in this scorecard process.
Okay. In my opinion, our finest achievement was that we learned to work together as a board. Previously, we were basically a pretty quiet board, offering advice here and there, but more putting in our time at the meetings as opposed to using that time to create change. Participation is part of the process now. Everyone has a voice, and more than often they use it. And it's such a difference from 4 years ago. As I had mentioned before, we've not completed the scorecard, but I feel confident that when we do look at the total results after we are done doing it, that we'll see that improvements have been made during the process as well as what we will look forward to be doing in the future. So it's as important to facilitate change during the process as it is to accept your results and move forward after you've completed it for the first time.
Absolutely. So what would you say, because again this is in development and we as a research network want to make sure that we get what we can out of this testing phase too, we feel like it's fair to ask the question, were there any sort of hiccups that you faced along the way or anything unexpected, even if positive, that came out of the process?
Yeah. I think the largest problem, and it's not a problem that you can't get past, but when the tool is perceived as a test, it seems to set in motion a competitive nature. And it can seem accusatory when questions are asked of something like a basic daily practice that may not be taking place. And people will jump to say, oh, yes, I am doing that. Or, of course, our co-op is compliant with these policies. When, in fact, that might not be the case. When participants feel they are being judged or tested, the result can be too many answers showing where they want to be as opposed to where they actually are. For example, if the question was, the board reviews its bylaws yearly and amends when necessary. The board feels it's being judged, so the answer to this question is more than likely going to be yes, when in fact the bylaws may not have seen the light of day for many years. So, you know, desperate honesty is needed when doing this assessment. I found it helpful to continually remind folks that this was an assessment, and it was our assessment. This is our tool for our store and for our improvement. It was a starting point. The only way to go from here is up. There's no score. There's only results, and we're not being judged on our abilities nor our actions. That was the biggest challenge. The other challenges were slight. Basic nature, like procuring interest enough to find people willing enough to dedicate the time. When members or staff or management or directors are reminded that it's their store, they are the owners, the desire to see it improve trumps the time issue in most cases. The offer of food doesn't hurt either. And seriously, we had our last couple months, we've had our 2 meetings at a local restaurant over appetizers. That lessens the feeling of doing work and made it more about a group effort to see our store grow. Last issue was the internet connection. If you're going to be inputting your results as you work through the scorecard, you're going to need that internet connection. We didn't have that. The way we bypassed this was by bringing a hard copy to the meeting, choosing someone to be the keeper of answers, and simply filling in the answers as we went along. This could be tedious if long discussions ensued, and they often did, but it wasn't hard to jot down the highlights once the back and forth had ended, and the results could then be inputted into a computer at another time when it was available, when time was available.
It sounds pretty ideal the way you undertook it in the sense of not just completing it for the sake of completing it, but having these sort of social and times for dialogue that a lot of boards don't necessarily take time for. So that's actually a pretty neat result, or approach, I should say. So what would you say to other co-ops who might be considering using the scorecard?
Well, just briefly, I think the scorecard is a fantastic way to bring your entire membership into the actual ownership realm of your store. The results can be a great topic for discussions at your AGMs, where you can get more suggestions and advice that can be offered from your membership. I also think it's a tool that can give directors more of a handle on their purpose as directors and to open the lines of communication between staff and management. And there's no time limit to this and can be used at its best to suit your store. You decide that. It does take a commitment, but then how can we affect change without commitment, right?
Good. Well, thank you so much, Siri. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
So we have had a few questions come in, so I'll start there. So we have the first one here from Ryszard Stocky from Poland, who's joined us. And so that puts you on the hot seat, Eric, for this one. So he's saying, taking into account that a co-op is a partnership of people and not capital, would they expect from the co-op index some feedback for the individuals, not only the co-op as a whole?
I don't think any of our participants were looking at it as an individual thing that they wanted their feedback. I think they all went into it with the purpose of what is going to be good for the cooperative as a whole. So I don't think they were looking for individual feedback. And they also, in order to have individual feedback, it may have compromised the whole question around confidentiality, which was very important for us, similar to what Siri said.
Okay, got it. Thank you very much. So it does raise an interesting element, though, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. In terms of having a tool that helps with sort of the part as well as the whole. Yep. So Siri, we've got a question coming in from Lynn Pittman out of Wisconsin. And so she's asking if you could say a bit more about the advantages and disadvantages of having such a comprehensive scorecard. And do you think there'd be advantages if the topics were addressed in separate standalone surveys?
For example, are you maybe asking that each portion of the scorecard be separated? Yeah, we had actually, because we had developed the tool, then we had had to do the entire tool from end to end. So we had more advantage in knowing which sections we could then use. One of our biggest issues was, as I mentioned, in governance and how we were going to set up our strategic plan and how we were going to make things work with regards to our store and working as a team. And so when we went back to use it, we zoned in on that area. And as I mentioned, also the process is where we've been learning most of our information. We have not turned in our words to get any results yet. But I think you could certainly use one portion of the scorecard, see where it takes you, and if it works for you, great. File it away until you feel that you need to use another area. There's no need to go through the entire process at once.
So we've got a couple more here for you, Siri. So, so you had mentioned that that members could be stakeholders in responding to the survey, and a question from Lily Eng, I believe, from the cooperators, has asked, could you clarify if they actually did engage in completing the survey?
Yes, on our group, the group that we had members from the community, we had staff. We had one staff member, we had 2 members from the community, we had 4 directors, and our manager took part. So we actually had 2 staff members. And so you had a good mix from every variety of input to answer these questions. And that's why some of the discussions took such long, tedious times to get through to come up with the answers, because some would say, oh, yes, we definitely do that, and others would say, no, that's never been done. And we'd have to defend ourselves and discuss it and find out where we needed to go with that particular question. And yeah, our co-op is a bit unique in the fact that our membership does take part very often in everything that goes on at the co-op. They want to see the minutes from the AGM. They want to see our bylaws. In fact, we're going over redoing our bylaws at this point. And so we're lucky that way. But I think it also, if you can bring members in from the community, those members are going to take the information back out to the community. So, you know, tells 2 friends, he tells 2 friends, and eventually you've got a whole group that's working towards the success of that store.
Perfect. Thank you. So, Eric, I've got a question for you, and I'm just wondering if you can expand a bit in terms of moving forward in Energreen. You know, what's the timeline for revisiting some of the results, or, you know, putting yourself through some new evaluation processes, keeping in mind that you've sort of, you know, you've taken this on, so where do we go from here?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would suspect that within the next year or 2, we will probably do something like this again. We've as I said, some of the original members of the co-op were looking to retire. That's now, there's more open discussion about that, and now we have a younger president, and there's been some change in some of the leadership. So as that starts to, that new leadership starts to solidify, I think they're going to say, okay, we need to do some visioning. We've had some recent discussion around branding ourselves a little more precisely, and so I think, yeah, we're ready to take this, do something like this again, and then use our original work as a baseline to proceed further.
Great. Thank you. So we've got one more question that has come in online for Siri. So this is from Jim Johnson, and he asks, does your co-op also use a distinct governance model, such as the Carver's policy governance model or the Taylor model? And how did you see the tool complementing or comparing two governance models if in fact you use them?
Well, to be very honest, I'm not sure if we use either of those governance models. We have basically used what we've learned, comparing it to other co-ops and speaking with other boards of directors that have had success with their governance issues. The governance rulings that we have or that have been stated are in our bylaws, and these were written back 65 years ago, so I'm not really sure where they started, where they got their information from. But what we learned from the tool was that when you delve into your principles, the co-op principles, and you learn about the, in particular for us, it was the structure of governance, how the communication works, that your board of directors has your president. Your president is the communication between yourself and the store. He talks to the manager, he or she. The manager then carries that information to the staff, but there isn't a melee of communication, and that was where our governance kicked in. I know that what the scorecard did for us was it raised the questions that we needed answers to. We realized where we weren't doing well, and very simply it was questions like, does your co-op follow this particular rule? And in fact, if we didn't, we asked ourselves why, and then found the right way to do it. So very, very basic, very simple.
And because you're affiliated with the Co-op Atlantic Network, and I know that a number of other stores within the Co-op Atlantic Network have been invited to use this too. I should mention that Co-op Atlantic is going through a process of developing better director education tools and program. And within that, just for your information, Jim, what I've seen so far hasn't sort of subscribed to a particular governance model. So another one coming from Lynn Pittman, and this is specifically about the Co-op Index for co-ops. She's asking, are there any tools under development that will help with next steps that are identified through the index? So for example, this commitment and worker equity question that you've raised.
I'm not aware of any others that are under development. I am aware that there's some tools that are available to the Francophone community, particularly that have been developed in the province of Quebec, but I don't know if they're as precise as what Lynn is asking in that.
If there is anything, and I haven't seen anything recently, then we'll make sure to link to it after this webinar too. Okay. Another question here from Millie Ng, and this is to either of you, and she's asked, were there any results that either impacted revenue or expenses, that is, any results that you can pinpoint to decreasing expenses or increasing revenue, so specifically looking at the business aspect of what you do?
Yeah, from the perspective of revenue and expenses, yeah, there's some indirect things that happened. For example, the area of intercooperation amongst cooperatives, that prepared us for the International Year of Cooperatives, so that when we came to that year of work with other cooperatives, the board was quite open to participate in that, and we got a lot of free advertising because the region picked it up really well to see these cooperatives doing their work together and things like that. So that I'm sure that created some opportunities for us that we wouldn't have been available to us for projects and work, just finding jobs that came into us. On the expense side, we probably spent a bit more money on the area of education as a result of this. We clearly identified the need for moving on to a younger generation of leadership, and we heavily invested in putting 3 people through the apprenticeship program for carpentry, 2 men and a woman, and that was a strong commitment on our board's perspective. So that would certainly affect the expense side. But yeah, I think so. Yes, there was things on both sides that affected the financial side.
Okay, and Sarah, specifically, was there anything that affected financials in your co-op going through the process with the scorecard?
Well, all I could think of really in this particular case was that we put together committees to go out and determine community needs assessment and what the community wanted from the co-op. And through that, things were developed, like our 50-50 program and our bursary program for the high school graduates. And all of the revenue that's come in, we've over $36,000 in the last 2 years we've been able to donate back to the community in different areas. But it has doubled our membership, whether that be because people want to come in and get in on the 50-50, I don't know. But it has in turn increased our sales because the people are coming into the store, they're purchasing, and they're enjoying, being part of that community and what it's giving back. So,
wow, that's substantial.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
It is substantial.
Okay, well, thank you so much to both of our speakers today and to everyone who's asked questions as well. I think we've been able to actually address all of the questions. So I want to thank everyone for participating. Thank you for our two speakers for sharing their process, and to everyone who's been involved in working towards getting these two tools developed and those who continue to work on it. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful week, and stay tuned for our fall webinar series.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Aaron.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.